The envelope was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home from my morning walk. I recognized the return address immediately. Precision Diagnostics, the lab my son-in-law's attorney had insisted on using. My daughter's wedding was in 4 hours. I set my coffee mug down without drinking from it and stood there for a long moment, just staring at that envelope. Outside, a neighbor's sprinkler was making its slow arc across the lawn. Normal Saturday sounds. Birds. Someone starting a lawnmower 2 houses down. And me, 63 years old, standing in my kitchen in my walking shoes, knowing that whatever was inside that envelope was about to change things that couldn't be unchanged. I should back up, because the way this ended only makes sense if you understand how it started. My daughter. I'll call her my girl because that's what she's always been to me, even at 31. Married a man named Coleman about 8 months before all of this happened. Coleman was 40, owned a regional logistics company, came from money the way some people come from a particular town. It was just where he was from, part of his geography, not something he thought about. She met him at a charity auction. He outbid her on a weekend at a vineyard in Napa, then handed her the certificate and said she deserved it more than he did. She called me that same night. "Dad," she said, "I think I just met someone." I liked Coleman well enough at first. He was measured, polite, the kind of man who remembers what you told him 3 months ago and asks a follow-up question. My late wife would have called him a good listener. But somewhere in the second year of their courtship, I started noticing things. Small things, the kind you don't bring up because you can't quite articulate them without sounding like an overprotective father. The way he sometimes answered a question she hadn't asked. The way he'd redirect a conversation that was getting too close to something he didn't want examined. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself a lot of things. They got married on a Saturday in October. Outdoor ceremony, 200 guests, my girl in a dress her mother had always described to her. They'd talked about it years before my wife passed. I cried during the vows. So did Coleman, which I gave him credit for. 7 months into the marriage, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was watching baseball, not really watching, just having the noise on the way you do when the house gets too quiet. She didn't say hello, just started talking. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not react until I'm finished." I muted the game. She was pregnant. That part didn't surprise me. They'd talked about starting a family. But what came next did. The pregnancy wasn't Coleman's. She was certain of it, had known for weeks, had been sitting with it alone because she didn't know what else to do. There was someone else, a man she'd worked with before the wedding, a situation she described as brief and stupid, and the worst mistake she'd ever made, something that had ended before Coleman was even in the picture, but had apparently left a consequence she hadn't known about until the timing made it impossible to ignore. I didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear her breathing. "Are you still there?" she asked. "I'm here," I said. "I'm going to tell him," she said. "I just needed to tell you first." She told Coleman that same week. I don't know exactly what that conversation looked like. She gave me the outline, not the details. But I know it lasted most of the night and ended with Coleman sleeping in the guest room. For 2 weeks after that, I heard from her in fragments. She was staying. They were talking. They were seeing a counselor. Then the fragments stopped, and 3 days went by without a word, which was unusual, and on the 4th day Coleman called me. In 15 years of knowing him, Coleman had never called me directly. We talked plenty, at dinners and holidays, and the odd weekend when they'd come down to stay, but he'd always called through her. His name appearing on my screen that morning sat wrong before I even answered. He was calm. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the brittle calm of someone holding something back, but something quieter than that. He asked if he could come by. He said he wanted to talk, man to man, and that he thought I deserved to know what was happening from him and not second-hand. He came that afternoon. sat in the same chair my wife used to read in, which bothered me more than I expected. He put a leather folder on the coffee table between us. He didn't open it right away. He told me they had decided to divorce, that there had been conversations with attorneys, that they were trying to keep things civil, that he genuinely didn't want to destroy her. Those were his exact words, genuinely didn't want to destroy her, but that he also couldn't stay in a marriage built on what he now knew. I told him I understood. I told him I was sorry. And I meant it, the way you mean something that is also true and also completely inadequate. Then he opened the folder. He said there was a financial component he wanted to discuss with me. Not because it concerned me directly, but because he felt I should know what he was offering before the attorneys made it more complicated. He had consulted with his team. He was prepared to give my daughter a settlement. The house they bought together, a lump sum. Continued health insurance through the end of the following year. It was generous. More than generous. Then he said there was one additional element. He said the child's father, the biological father, had been identified. The man's name was someone my daughter had apparently been honest with Coleman about, a former colleague, and Coleman's attorneys had already made contact. There would be a paternity establishment process, a formal legal acknowledgement, child support structured according to the state guidelines. He'd already had an independent lab conduct a preliminary test using materials provided voluntarily by the biological father. That was what was in the envelope he'd sent to Precision Diagnostics for a second confirmation. The one currently sitting on my kitchen table 8 months later. Except I'm getting ahead of myself, because that's not the part that sent everything sideways. What Coleman said next, before he closed the folder and picked up his coffee, was this. He was getting remarried. Not eventually. Soon, he'd met someone. A woman he'd known professionally for years, a situation that had apparently developed sometime in the previous year, though he was careful about his exact language there. The new wedding was scheduled. He was telling me because he was going to be out of contact for a stretch around the date, and he didn't want my daughter trying to reach him through me when he didn't respond. I sat with that for a moment. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that your wedding is already scheduled?" He said yes. "And the divorce papers aren't finalized?" He said the attorneys were close. He said it would be done in time. I asked him when the wedding was. He told me. 6 weeks away. I walked him to the door. We shook hands. I stood on my front porch and watched his car pull out of the driveway and disappear round the corner. And then I went inside and called my daughter. She already knew about the other woman. Had known for a while, she said. She didn't say it with anger, which worried me more than anger would have. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who has already done their grieving in private and is now just moving through the remaining steps. The next 6 weeks were documents and phone calls. I helped where I could, mostly by being a steady voice at the end of the line when she needed one. Her attorney was sharp, handled the settlement efficiently. Coleman's people were professional. Everything moved the way these things move when both parties have resources and no one wants a protracted fight. The final papers were signed on a Thursday. I remember because she called me when she left the attorney's office, and I could hear traffic behind her, and she said, "It's done, Dad," and I said, "Okay, sweetheart," and neither of us said anything else for a few seconds. 3 days later, Coleman's wedding morning arrived, and that's when I found the envelope on my kitchen table. My daughter had asked Precision Diagnostics to mail the second confirmation to me rather than to her. She said she couldn't look at it yet, and she trusted me to tell her what it said. I hadn't expected it to arrive on this particular day, but there it was. I sat down at the table. The name of the biological father, as confirmed by the first test, was a man I'd never met, a former colleague of my daughter's from a marketing firm she'd worked at 4 years ago. A man who had, according to her, been entirely willing to cooperate with the paternity process. A man who, by all accounts, intended to be present and financially responsible. I opened the envelope. The results were on a single sheet, clean and clinical, the kind of document that has no awareness of the weight it carries. I read it once, then I read it again. The results did not match the preliminary test. The man identified in the first test was excluded as the biological father at a statistical certainty of 99.97%. The preliminary test, the one done voluntarily, outside of formal legal channels, conducted by a different lab, had either been incorrect, or something had gone wrong in the sample collection, or something had gone wrong in the sample collection, or something else entirely had happened that I was not yet able to name. I set the paper on the table. Outside, my neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. The sprinkler was running again. Coleman, at this moment, was presumably at a ceremony somewhere, beginning a new chapter. And I was sitting at my kitchen table holding a document that said we still didn't know who my grandchild's father was. I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring, and I could tell by her voice that she'd been awake for a while. I told her to sit down. She told me she was already sitting. I read her the relevant section of the results, slowly, and when I finished she was quiet for long enough that I said her name to make sure she was still there. "That's not possible," she said. I told her I was looking at it. More silence. "So what does this mean?" she asked. "Legally, what does this mean?" I told her I didn't know exactly, that her attorney would need to see this, that the paternity agreement Coleman had pushed through had been built on the preliminary result, which meant there was now a significant problem with that agreement, that the man who'd signed a voluntary acknowledgement of paternity had signed it based on a test that was now contradicted. "Dad," she said very quietly, "I've only been with 2 people. I know that's not what it looks like, but I'm telling you, there are only 2 possible fathers." I believed her. Not because she's my daughter. I like to think I'm honest enough not to let that cloud my judgment, but because of the way she said it. There are moments when you can hear the truth in someone's voice, the way you can hear rain before it starts. This was one of those moments, which meant the problem wasn't her accounting of things. The problem was that both possible fathers had now been excluded by laboratory testing. Her attorney contacted Coleman's attorney that same afternoon. The paternity agreement, which had been filed as part of the divorce settlement, was now on uncertain legal ground. Coleman's people responded within 2 hours, which told me their attorneys had been expecting some kind of complication, or at least had a reflex for moving quickly. The response was measured but clear. Coleman considered the divorce final and the settlement closed. The paternity question was, in his legal team's language, a matter between my daughter and the biological father, and no longer a matter in which he had standing. My daughter's attorney pushed back. The paternity agreement was part of the divorce settlement. If the agreement was built on faulty testing, the integrity of the related documents could be questioned. This went back and forth for the better part of 2 weeks. During that time, Coleman did not contact my daughter directly. She did not try to contact him. I stayed in close touch with her attorney, not because I had any legal standing, but because she found it calming to have me there, and being there for her was the only useful thing I had to offer. Meanwhile, the question of the actual biological father had to be answered. My daughter went back through everything she could, dates, records, anything that would help narrow the window. There was, as she had said, only one other person it could possibly be. Someone she had not thought to mention initially because she had been so certain it was the first man. Someone she had, in fact, dated briefly in the period between relationships. During a stretch she described as a low point, she'd moved past and tried not to revisit. His name was someone I had heard mentioned once, years ago in passing. She called him one evening, explained the situation. I was there in the room. She'd asked me to be, said she needed someone steady nearby, and I could hear his side only in pieces, his voice through the speaker, small and surprised, and then, gradually, quiet in a different way. He agreed to be tested. The results came back 11 days later. He was the father. I was sitting at my kitchen table again when she called to tell me, which struck me as the kind of coincidence that isn't really a coincidence, just life cycling through its available furniture. She was crying, not the devastated kind, more the kind that comes from relief, mixed with exhaustion and a grief you can't quite locate, the sense of having finally landed somewhere solid after a very long time in the air. "Okay," I said. Okay, now we know. What do I do now? She asked. I told her what I believed to be true, which is the only useful thing I've ever been able to offer. You start with what you know, and you move forward from there. The man who was the father had a name and a phone number and had agreed without hesitation to whatever was needed. The legal agreements would be revised. The paternity establishment would be refiled. Her attorney was already making calls. Coleman's new marriage was, by then, a little over 2 weeks old. I don't know if he was told about the final DNA results. I assume his attorneys made him aware of the legal implications. Beyond that, it was no longer my business to speculate. My daughter bought a small house, smaller than the one she'd shared with Coleman, which I think she wanted, in a neighborhood with good schools. She painted the nursery a pale green she described as the color of a deep breath, which I thought was the most sensible thing she'd said in months. I drove up and helped her assemble furniture on a Sunday, and we ordered pizza and ate it on the floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes, and she put her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small and said, "Thank you for not telling me everything was going to be fine when you didn't know that." I said, "Would that have helped?" She said, "No." "Then I'm glad I didn't say it," I told her. My granddaughter was born on a Tuesday in March, 7 pounds and 3 ounces. A full head of dark hair. Lungs she was clearly not shy about using. I was in the waiting room when the nurse came out. I stood up faster than a 63-year-old man probably should, and I had to grab the chair for a second. And the nurse looked at me with the particular patience that people in that job develop, and said, "They're both doing beautifully." I thanked her. I sat back down. I put my face in my hands for a minute, not because anything was wrong, but because some moments require a brief surrender to the weight of them. Her father was in the delivery room. I hadn't been sure he would be, but he was, and he held her first, and when I finally got to come back and see them, he was standing near the window with her in his arms, looking like a man who understood he had just become responsible for something that mattered far beyond his own preferences or comfort. I've seen that look before. It doesn't belong to any particular type of man. It comes over whoever is holding the child. I held my granddaughter for a long time that afternoon. She had my wife's hands. I know that sounds like the thing grandparents say, but I've never been prone to that kind of projection, and these were genuinely her grandmother's hands. The same proportion, the same particular way the fingers curled. I sat in that hospital chair and held her and thought about everything that had to go exactly wrong for this moment to arrive exactly right. And I did not have a satisfying conclusion to draw from it, only the fact of her, small and warm and entirely real. The paternity agreement was refiled the following month. The financial arrangements were handled between attorneys, straightforwardly enough. Coleman's settlement with my daughter stood, as it turned out. Her attorney had managed to insulate the core terms from the paternity complications. She kept the lump sum, kept the health insurance extension, bought a small house with the pale green nursery. I go up every other Sunday now. Sometimes I stay for dinner. Sometimes we just sit in her living room while the baby sleeps in the next room. And we don't talk about any of it. Not Coleman, not the tests, not the weeks when none of us knew anything. We just sit. The way you sit with someone when you've been through something together and there's nothing left to explain. I made a decision somewhere in the middle of all of it. A quiet one. The kind you don't announce. I decided that my job was not to understand everything. Not to arrive at some final accounting that made it all make sense. My job was to be the steady voice at the end of the line, to drive up on Sundays, to assemble furniture and eat pizza on the floor. My wife used to say that love isn't a feeling, it's a practice. She said it enough times that I used to tease her about it. I don't tease her about it anymore. She's been gone 6 years, and I've had a long time to understand what she meant. Love is what you do with your hands and your time and your presence, repeated without expectation of return. My granddaughter doesn't know any of this yet. She's 3 months old. The biggest problem in her life is the 4 minutes between when she decides she's hungry and when the bottle arrives. She'll learn the rest of it eventually, as much of it as she needs to know, in whatever way her parents decide to tell it. But she'll know she was wanted. She'll know that the people around her showed up. She'll know her grandfather drives up every other Sunday without being asked, and holds her in the same chair by the window and tells her, quietly, about her grandmother's hands. That's enough. That's more than enough. I deleted the photo I'd taken of the DNA results. I don't know why I'd taken it in the first place. Some instinct to document, and I felt the relief of it leave my phone. That particular lightness of letting something go that you've been carrying longer than necessary. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold, the way it always does when I get distracted by the morning. I drank it anyway. I've thought about what I would have done differently, and the honest answer is, not much. Not because I handled everything right. I didn't. Not always. But because most of what happened wasn't mine to handle. It was my daughter's life, her choices, her consequences, and the best thing I could offer was to stay close enough to catch her and far enough away to let her stand. There's a version of this story where I look back and assign blame cleanly. Coleman did this. She did that. The lab made an error. But that's not how things actually work in my experience. What I watched unfold over those months was more like a series of small decisions made by people under pressure, and each decision narrowed the options for the next one. Coleman rushed the preliminary paternity agreement because he wanted the divorce closed before his new wedding. My daughter deferred to the first test result because she was exhausted and wanted certainty. The man who voluntarily signed an acknowledgement did so in good faith, based on flawed information. Nobody was twirling a mustache. They were all just moving fast through something they didn't fully understand. And the second DNA result was what happened when reality caught up with the pace they'd set. What I kept coming back to, sitting in that kitchen with that piece of paper, was how much of what we call a crisis is really just clarity arriving at an inconvenient time. The truth was always there. The biology was always what it was. The test didn't create a problem. It just made the existing problem visible. And the only thing to do with visible problems is deal with them. I've been 63 years old for about 8 months now. I don't say that to be glib about age. I say it because at 63 you've lived through enough of your own reckonings to recognize one when it's happening to someone you love. You've made choices you couldn't undo. You've watched consequences arrive on schedules you didn't set. And if you've paid any attention at all, you've learned that how you respond in those moments, not what caused them, not who's to blame, is the only part that actually defines you. My daughter could have collapsed under all of it. The betrayal, the legal mess, the uncertainty about something as fundamental as who fathered her child. I watched her instead make one clear-headed decision after another. She called her attorney. She went back through the timeline with honesty and precision. She made a phone call that required more courage than most people will ever have to summon. And when the real answer finally arrived, she let herself cry for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she asked what came next. That's not something I taught her. Or maybe it is, in the way that anything is taught, not through instruction, but through repetition, through watching someone else do it, through absorbing over a lifetime the understanding that falling apart is allowed, but staying there is optional. Coleman moved on. The man who is actually her daughter's father showed up when it mattered. My granddaughter is 3 months old and has no idea any of this happened. She'll learn, someday, what she needs to know. What I hope she learns from all of us is this, that character isn't what you project when things are going well. It's what you do when the second test comes back, and the answer isn't what anyone expected. It's whether you tell the truth. Whether you pick up the phone, whether you drive up on Sunday and help put the furniture together. I picked up my cold coffee that morning and I drank it anyway. Some things you just finish.